school today and you want to actually turn your Bible, you can. Turn your Bible to Colossians chapter 3 today. And today, Paul is going to teach us about Jesus in the workplace. Jesus in the workplace. And we've been in this series, and the theme of Colossians is Jesus, period. Now, we've got another little tagline that's the theme. And I want you to say it if you know it with me. If you've been here any length of time through this series, you know what this is. Let's say it together. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And here's what Paul's going to teach us today. He's going to talk about Jesus in the marketplace. Jesus in the workforce. And today we're going to learn four qualities, four things that we must know as employees working in the workplace. And then Paul's going to teach us about three things. If you're a boss, if you're a supervisor, if you're a manager, if you have direct reports under you, three things specifically that Paul's going to say if we're going to live with Jesus, period, in the workplace. And this is why this is so significant. Because too many people today, they have a secular sacred divide. Too many people, it's like, okay, we're going to worship God. When it comes to my workplace, I can just turn Jesus off and then I'll turn him back on when I'm at church. And the Bible is very clear that Jesus wants us to live with Jesus, period, in every environment that we're in. Now, for most of us, work consumes much of our time. I read this week, assuming that you work an average of 50 hours a week between the ages of 22 and 65, you will have worked 111,800 hours. That is 45% of your waking hours you will spend at your workplace. Now, that's not including commuting and overtime and business trips and planning and how about this? Thinking and working about work-related matters while you're not at work. Work consumes a lot of our attention, a lot of our energy, and a lot of our time. Now, I also read this week, according to a Gallup poll, 6 in 10 American workers said that they would continue to work even if they won $10 million in the lottery. But here's what's interesting. 35% of those people that said that they would continue to work said that they would stay at the same job. 65% of people said, if I didn't have to work at this place, I wouldn't work here. We're in a series called Jesus, period. So how do we take this job and love it? How do we move from shoving it to loving it? Paul's going to give us some instruction in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 22. Here's what he says. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Now, we just need to stop and we need to call a quick time out right here. Because when we read this word slaves, we automatically have some negative thought patterns that are associated, that are linked with this word slaves. And rightfully so. I mean, as you look back in our country, the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, there are some disgusting things, the way that we treated human beings. And I believe that God loves every single one of us, no matter the color of our skin, no matter our age, no matter our race, no matter what it is, that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. And listen, we will work hard here at our church to love everybody because we refuse any form of prejudice. We believe that God so loved the world. And so I am disgusted when I hear about slavery. And even this morning I read in the USA Today, there's a big article today about slavery. And slavery's not gone. As a matter of fact, they estimate there are 60,000 slaves, according to USA Today. This morning I read this. 60,000 slaves right here in the United States of America. India is the #1 country right now that is reported of having the most slaves. But I want us to understand today, what Paul is speaking of here is not what we would think of in our mind as slaves. Historians tell us that back in this day and age and time, these aren't even biblical theologians, these are historians. They tell us that at that time there were 60 million Roman slaves during this day and age and time. And so when we think about slaves, and what we think about is much different than what Paul is speaking about here in Colossians chapter 3. What he's speaking out is what we would refer to as employees and employers. So when you hear the word slave, that would be employee. Or when you hear the word master, that would be an employer. That would be a supervisor, a boss, a direct, people that have direct reports under them. And historians will also tell us that in Roman times, during this time when this was written, that, man, Roman slaves were educated. They were skilled individuals. They were teachers and craftsmen and beauticians and doctors and secretaries and cooks and waiters and waitresses and treasurers and groundskeepers and mechanics and political advisors, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, I thank God that slavery is no longer a part of our culture to the extent that it was at one time. But don't discount Paul's words here today. Make sure that you understand them in the right context. So now that you understand that as a foundation, let me give you 4 things employees need to do to live with Jesus, period, at work. Paul says this: obey, it would say, employees, obey your earthly bosses in everything that you do. He would say this: number 1, complete your assigned tasks. Complete your assigned tasks. Now, this assumes that you know what your boss wants. How many of you have ever worked for a boss and you have no idea what their expectations are? And their expectations change all the time. I believe that clear expectations make for great relationships. That's true in the marriage relationship, that's true if you're a parent-child, and that's also true in the employee-employer relationship. Clear expectations make for great relationships. So you got to understand what your boss wants. If you're unclear, go get clear. If at all possible, make sure that it's written. Now, I'm not much for job descriptions, and the reason why is because they're too vague. And most people, they don't use them to measure performance. Here at Crosspointe Church, what we do, what I've done is, man, our church has grown significantly. We grew from 70 people to nearly 1,000 people worship with us on the weekends, and all 4 of our services combined together. Our staff has grown from 2 or 3 of us around the table to all of a sudden, okay, now we've got 12, plus we've got a preschool, we've got 25 plus employees that are here. We're not big, but here's what I've learned. I've learned that I have to be very clear with expectations. And one thing I appreciate is when people don't understand the expectations, that we get clarity that's there. We use something we call the 6x6 here. And here's the way it works. We say these are the 6 things that we're going to focus on in the next 6 months. And so whenever I'm meeting with all my direct reports, I say, let's go over those 6 things. What are the 6 things? Why? Because I want to make sure that there is clarity of expectations. And then we run it through what's called a SMART filter. Some of you are familiar with this. You know this filter. It's called, make sure that our 6x things are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And we work through that filter. Now, you may need to go to your direct report, your supervisor, your owner. You might say, hey, it's my desire to please you. I want to make sure that I complete the expectations that you have for me. So help me get an A. If I were to get an A in my assigned role, what would be some of the assignments? What would be some of the behaviors? What would be some of the actions that I would be pursuing? Paul says this. He's very clear. Obey your earthly bosses and supervisors. Now, there's one exception to this rule. We're to obey our boss, except when our bosses violate God's law. If they ever put pressure on you to lie or do something unethical, our supreme duty is to obey God. God tells us to obey our boss, but we should. But when they come in conflict with what God's word says, he says we're to obey God rather than man. Here's the second thing that Paul teaches us. He says go above and beyond what's asked of you. Here's what he says. Try to please them all the time, not just when they're watching you. Now, this made me kind of laugh some, because we all know that whenever the boss walks in, we've all seen this happen before, that people like minimize solitaire. You know, people like get off their smartphones, and all of a sudden people start pretending like they're working all of a sudden. And that's what Paul says. He says, listen, don't just work when your boss is watching you. Make sure that you are working at all times. I remember when I was a youth pastor, I would work hard to complete my assigned task. And I was building a youth ministry and lead students to find and follow Jesus. And a couple times a year, when I would get everything done, I would set an appointment with my senior pastor. And I remember I'd walk into his office and I would say something like this. I'd say, Pastor, I have all of my stuff done right now. Everything that I've been completed. Now I'm a pretty good delegator, okay? But I also inspect, all right? You don't do what people, people don't do what you expect them to do. They do what you inspect. So I was delegating, I was inspecting things, and I would go to my pastor and I'd say, Pastor, I have everything done. Is there anything that I can do to help you? Is there anything that's draining you right now? Is there something I can take off of your plate? Is there something I can do to help you accomplish the vision that God has put on your heart to do? Maybe some of you could have a conversation like that. That's what it means to please them all the time. Now, you can't do that unless you're getting your stuff done first. Paul is suggesting do more than average. I'm amazed at how many people in the workforce are in love with average, aren't you? It's amazing. Have you ever tried to call somebody up, maybe an electrician, maybe you're somebody to work in your air conditioning, whatever it may be, you call somebody up and you're like, hey, can you come out and help me fix it? They don't show up. You ever had that happen to you? Or else you send a call and they just don't respond back. You're like, man, I thought people are looking for work. I thought people need help. And man, we have an average workforce at best. And Paul says as followers of Jesus, we should make sure that we do more than average. Instead of trying to compete with other people, man, work to complete them. John Maxwell, leadership expert, he suggests asking for a 10-minute meeting with the boss of your company. He says, go in. For some of you, you may just need to introduce yourself. You may work for a big workforce. But it says, thank them or her, him or her for giving you the opportunity to work in the company. Then give them your cell phone, he says. Give them your cell phone number. Tell them if they need anything business-related done, they can call you anytime. Then just leave. I believe as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we should be the best employees. We should be the most dependable. We should have the highest integrity. We should have the most character of anyone else as followers of Jesus Christ. And we should work, and we should work hard. Let me tell you, one of the greatest compliments that I ever received was just recently. I was at a business community event, and the owner of the Chick-fil-A here in Yorba Linda came up to me, and he said, "You're Pastor Brian from Crosspointe Church." I said, "Yes." He said, "I just hired another employee from Crosspointe Church." He said, "I have so many people that work at Chick-fil-A here in Yorba Linda from your church." And he says, "They are some of the best employees that I've ever had." Can I tell you, that speaks highly of our church? And may that be said about all of us as followers of Jesus Christ. That we work hard to please our boss at all times, not just when they're watching us. And then Paul says this, number 3, serve sincerely. He says, serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Now, service is a buzzword in business today. I love reading about leadership, and I read a lot of business books every year, and I love to read about business. And one of the things that I've noticed is that our economy really teaches us a lot about being service-based. We know that better customer service is a serious business advantage. But I want you to understand what Paul is speaking about here is not the same thing that we read in business books today. It's not the same thing that Harvard Business Reviews are teaching us. See, because for all the talk about service, the underlying principle can still be self-interest. Business gurus, they teach to serve others is a good way to get what you want out of them. That if people feel like you care about them, they'll fork over more money. But the service that Paul is speaking about here in Colossians chapter 3, it's a 180-degree turn from the you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours mentality. It's a question of motivation. What is your motivation for serving other people? Is it to oblige them so they owe you one? Is it to serve them so that you build your own image and your own brand? Is it to serve them to build reciprocation so they'll do something back for you? Or is it a selfless desire to see another person benefit? That is God's standard of service. It's the habit of forgetting about yourself, forgetting about your career trajectory, forgetting about your bottom line in order to take care of somebody else. Here's what serving is. It's the art and it is the act of focusing on someone else's interests and not your own. The work that God intends us to do, it always involves a mindset of service to other people. He says, serve them sincerely, not so you get something back, but out of reverent fear of the Lord. I went to lunch with a man in our church recently. He's been in our church for about a year, and I've come to highly respect this man. He's a very smart individual. And we were sitting down and we were discussing leadership. And he told me, he said, you know, Brian, he said, you talk a lot about leadership. And I said, I love leadership. I said, you know, I love to read books on leadership, and I devour leadership. And, you know, outside of talking about Jesus and my family, I love talking about leadership. And here's what he said to me. He said, Brian, how many times is the word leadership used in the Bible? And I knew the answer. I said, 3. He said, how many times is the word servant used in the Bible? I was like, ouch. I don't know. So I went back. He didn't tell me the answer. I went back. I looked it up. 163 times Jesus speaks about being a servant. I believe that Jesus is penetrating to you and I, not to be a leader. Because here's the thing about leadership. Oftentimes, it is about getting a pat on your back, you being significant, you being something, you being noticed, and you being seen because you're a leader. And what Jesus wants is he wants us to serve. And to serve other people sincerely, out of reverence and fear of the Lord. That's a game changer. Serving, let me tell you, though, is risky. Because people are messy. And the closer you get to them, the higher your chance of getting dirty. And when you begin to truly serve other people, you won't always be noticed. And you won't always be appreciated. And if you serve other people, oftentimes you will be taken for granted. And I'll just be flat out honest. Serving is draining. Because it's literally spending yourself. But isn't that example of what Jesus did? Remember what Jesus did before he went to the cross? He had his final meal, the Last Supper. And you know what I would be doing if I was Jesus, having my last pep talk with the disciples before I'm about to die and go to heaven? I would say, listen to everything I'm about to tell you. Get your pens and your pencils out, because I'm getting ready to leave, and you need to know what to do. But you know what Jesus did? They came in. He disrobed himself, and he took a towel and a basin and water, and he began to massage and clean filthy, disgusting disciples' toes that were filled with like cow dung all over them and horse dung. And then he said this: if you want to be great, serve others. And serve them sincerely, not for what you get back. Serve them out of reverent fear of the Lord. How do we know if we're truly serving? I love what Robert Greenleaf in his book on Becoming a Servant Leader says. He says, do those being served grow as a person? Do they, while being served, do they become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, and more likely themselves to become a servant? And that is a great mirror to be able to reflect back if you're truly serving or not, back to the motivation. If you want to lead at the highest level, mark it down. You have to be willing to serve at the lowest level. That's what true servant leadership is. And the last thing Paul would teach us, those of you that are employees, he would say this: be eternally motivated. Be eternally motivated. He says in verse 23, work willingly at whatever you do, as though you're working for the Lord rather than for people. That's eternal motivation. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward. Anybody ever had an inheritance? Raise your hand if you've ever got an inheritance. Anybody expected an inheritance? Raise your hand. I'm talking like one of those inheritance like, oh, glory be to God inheritances, okay? That's what Paul is speaking about here. He's saying, oh, happy day, okay? You have an inheritance coming. And he says, if you work hard and you work as if you were serving me and me alone, I'm going to give you an inheritance. I'm going to bless you. And that the master you're serving, the boss you have, it's not who's on the flow chart. It's Jesus Christ. But if you do what's wrong, you're going to be paid back for the wrong you've done. You're going to reap what you sow. For God has no favorites. You know, I can honestly say, I know that I worked hard for every boss that I've had, every senior pastor that I've served under. When I was at the college, serving under there. And can I tell you that I believe that God is honoring me today with some of the staff and some of the team that we have here. because of the hours and the work and the laboring and serving and all the things that I've done before in the past, that we are blessed to have such a great team right here at Crosspointe Church, of people that work, that serve diligently. And I believe God's blessing me, not just for my work that I did while I was being paid, but man, I also contributed a lot of volunteer hours. And I serve tirelessly for God and for His work and for His kingdom. And I believe that God is blessing me right now through you and through your service of how you serve other people in Jesus' name. And God will do the same for you, but you got to be eternally motivated. There are 3 types of motivation. There is external motivation. That's what the world uses mostly, is external motivation. And I'm not against it. Matter of fact, we use some external motivation around here. External motivation is when you get a pay raise, or whenever you get a bonus, or you get some kind of a trip, or you get a title, or you get more responsibility, or you get the corner office, whatever it may be. That's all external motivation. We're familiar with that. There's a second level of motivation, though, that's even greater than this external motivation. It's internal motivation. This is whenever you are a self-starter. This is whenever you have goals and you have inward drive. And whenever I'm hiring people, as our church has grown significantly and our staff has grown, I'm looking for people that have character, that have competency, that have Christ-likeness, that have high capacity, and also have inner drive. I don't want to hold people's hand. I want people that are hungry, that have a desire to be able to do what God's called them to do and make sure that they're in the right seat of the bus. Internal motivation is very important, but there's something greater than external motivation and internal motivation. And if you work, you need to listen to this. It's eternal motivation. It's recognizing that what you are doing, you are truly working for God. And God sees what you're doing. That means that if you agree to work 9 to 5, you work 9 to 5. And you think maybe your boss won't see you if you cut out early or you call in. Listen, you're not working for your boss, you're working for God. And the eyes of the Lord are in every place. He sees the evil and He sees the good. That means that if you go on a business trip, you don't abuse the company credit card. It says, guess what? I'm going to use this within the parameters that I've been given. It means that if you leave a place, you leave a place with honor. Maybe they didn't treat you fairly, but if you're eternally motivated, you're going to leave a place without airing out all the dirty laundry. And if you're going to leave quietly. You're going to give your 2 weeks notice. Let's move on. Let's talk to the bosses now. Let's talk to those that are supervisors. Let's talk to those of you that have direct reports that work under you. Because did you know that the average person works 4.4 years at one place? They tell us 4.4 years. And here's what I'd say to you. You that are supervisors, bosses, anybody that is an owner, listen to me very clearly. People don't quit companies. They quit people. They don't quit companies. They quit people. They don't like their manager. They don't like the way they're being treated. They don't feel like there's clear expectations. They quit people. So as followers of Jesus Christ, we have to understand, how can we be a good boss? How can we be a good supervisor? How can we be a good servant leader? And here's what Paul says. I'll tell you what, let's have a little fun first. I got to tell you, I have a vice. Here's my vice. Before I go to bed, almost every single night, I like to watch an episode of The Office. It's my vice, okay? I'm ashamed to admit it. But anybody else watch The Office? All right, I want you to just watch this clip from The Office.
Remember when people used to say boss when they were describing something that was really cool? Like, those shoulder pads are really boss, man. Look at that perm. That perm is so boss. It's what made me want to become a boss. And I look so good in perm and shoulder pads. But now, boss is just slang for jerk in charge.
I think for many of us, boss is just slang for jerk in charge. That is so true. So what do we do? How do we live with Jesus, period, in the workplace? Here's what Paul says, Colossians chapter 4, verse 1. Bosses, supervisors, owners, masters, be just and fair to your employees. Remember that you also have a master in heaven. So the first thing is this: be just. What does it mean to be just? That means do what is right. Clarify your vision. Your vision basically is being clear about what mountain you're going to climb. Now, listen, I can relate with many of you because I'm in a similar situation as you, and I can tell you, you won't always have certainty when it comes to the future and what you're going to do exactly, and you won't always have certainty, but you must have clarity. You have to have clarity in your vision. That's why we try to be very clear, to keep our vision very concise and very short. If you know it, say it with me. Our vision is to lead people to... Now, I'm just curious, in your workplace, would people know what your vision is? If you were to ask them, so what's our vision? Would they know? I can tell you, our staff knows our vision. I can tell you, our volunteers, we know our vision here. It's to lead people to find and follow Jesus. The next thing you have to be very clear about is your values as well. Because your values determine your behaviors. We have 8 core values here at Crosspointe, and I try to slowly drip them to you every single week because these are the behaviors we believe that God has called us to. One of them is excellence. And we say it like this. We've taken one core value, and then we made a statement that made our heart beat fast, that we believe is biblical. And it's this: we always bring our best to create relevant environments that honor God and inspire people. And our verse is, whatever you do it all to the glory of God. And we test this value by asking this question: does this honor God and does it inspire people? And here's the great thing about having values, is that you can hold people accountable whenever you have written values. So I can be able to go down to our kids ministry and say, one of our values, okay, is to honor God and inspire people. Did that honor God? Did that inspire people? Excellence is doing the best with what you have. And there are times you can correct people, and you don't have to be subjective as the boss and the bad guy. When you come back and say, these are the values, and what I'm noticing that you're doing and what I see here is not meshing up with the values. So clarify your values, and then clarify your individual expectations. You want to know the worst teachers? The worst teachers I had, the worst professors I had in college, the worst professors I had in seminary getting my master's degree, the worst professors in high school and even elementary were those that would sneak something in on the test that you didn't study. You know those teachers? Listen, if you want people to get an A, tell them how to get an A. And too many bosses and supervisors, they don't give specific instruction. Sit down and say, if you want to get an A, here's exactly how you can do it. It's this, and I'm going to hold you accountable to doing this, doing what's right. Now, we live in a different world than where we used to live in. A couple months ago, I went to a seminar on millennials. These are people that are under 36 years old. And people are having a very difficult time understanding how do we manage people that are 36 years old and under, because they're completely different than the baby boomer generation. Here's what I learned. They want feedback in real time. They're money motivated. They want on-the-job training, not classroom training. They want you to tell them what to do, not how to do it. Now, this is important to me because most of our staff is under the age of 36. And I'm hiring a lot of people in their 20s, a lot of people in their 30s. So I'm saying, okay, well, how do we work this? They prefer coaching rather than instructing. They want you to coach them rather than tell them what to do. They're not job jumpers, but they're always looking at the future. They want you to reward them. Remember, they got a trophy for everything growing up. They need a lot of rewards. They don't want to take as much risk. And here's why: because they watch the boomer generation, baby boomer generation. They watch their mom and their dad take a lot of risk and lose a lot. They've lost their families. They've lost their mom. They've lost their dad because of risk that they've taken in the workplace. So guess what they need? They need to be pushed a little bit. They need to be pushed to take some more risk. They want relationships. They want you to listen to them. They expect you to be interested in their input. Paul says, be just. And he also said, be fair. Treat your employees fairly. People don't do what you expect them to do. They do what you inspect. So make sure that you inspect, but make sure that you treat them fairly. And I don't have time right now, I'm out of time, but in your Crosspointe notes, one of my mentors has given me a whole list of ways people like to be thanked. And you know, people like to be thanked way more than money. As a matter of fact, money is just a small piece of it. And so if you want to know how people like to be thanked, just ask them. If you want to know how your employees, I know the top 3 ways every single person on staff here wants to be thanked. And I try to reward them appropriately. Let me tell you, they're all different. How do I know? I just ask them. That's a great tool to be able to use to treat people fairly. And then lastly is this: never forget that you answer to your boss in heaven. Remember that you have a master in heaven. If you decide to create inferior products because of greed, Things that are going to wear out quickly, so they have to be replaced sooner, so you can profit more. God sees that. If you're representing your products falsely by exaggerating marketing ads just to make sales, God sees that. If you are providing fair and just wages and benefits and treating other people like you want to be treated, God sees that. If you fail to furnish comfortable and good working conditions, God sees it. If you don't observe a Sabbath rest for all your employees as well as yourself, you're breaking one of God's 10 commandments. Number 3, keep the Sabbath day holy. And God has a rhythm, and it works like this. Work, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rest. Would you say it with me? It's God's rhythm. We've forgotten it. Let's say it together. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rest. Say it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rest. Now listen to me closely. I challenge you because some of you are saying, well, I don't have time to rest. And I would say that if you'll do it God's way and you will work hard for 6 days a week and you'll take 1 day of rest, then you will be more productive by taking your 1 day of rest than you will by working 7 straight days. That's God's way of doing it. Never forget that you're working for your boss in heaven. Make sure you're correcting your workers when necessary, but do it with kindness and grace. God sees all of that. I'll leave you with this story. Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel. And as he was painting, talk about excellence. It's breathtaking. He was 37 whenever he completed it, but he looked like an old man. He had worked so hard on the Sistine Chapel. He lost most of his eyesight working diligently on the Sistine Chapel. One day he was working in an obscure corner. He was working for hours and hours and hours in this little dark corner. And this man came in and he said, Michelangelo, why are you spending so much time diligently working in this little small dark corner that no one will ever see? And Michelangelo replied, God will see it. God will see it. That, my friends, is eternal motivation. May we be the best workers for God's honor and for God's glory. And God says, I see it, and I will bless you for it, and I will bring favor upon it whenever you do it God's way. Jesus, period. Jesus in a workplace.